She had run so far from the life that had nearly broken her that her boots had worn through at the heel, and the Colorado night had turned so cold she could no longer feel her fingers. And that was when she heard the cabin door open and the mountain man stepped out with a lantern held high, his shadow falling across the snow like the silhouette of something ancient and unmovable. Her name was Clara Mae Whitfield, and she was 23 years old, and she was done being afraid of herself. That was what she had told herself when she climbed out of the second-story window of her uncle's house in Pueblo, Colorado, 3 nights ago, in the autumn of 1879. She had told herself she was done shrinking, done pulling her shawl tighter to hide the generous roundness of her hips, done hunching her shoulders forward to disguise the fullness of her chest, done listening to her Uncle Gerald mutter about how no decent man would take her on unless she made herself smaller. Smaller in body, smaller in voice, smaller in every way that mattered. She had sewn every cent she owned into the hem of her underskirt, strapped the satchel her mother had left her across her back, and she had run. She had not planned particularly well beyond the running part. She had taken the stage north from Pueblo, intending to reach Denver and find work in one of the hotels there, but the stage had broken an axle in the mountain pass just as a late October storm rolled down off the Rockies with the kind of casual brutality that the Colorado high country delivered without apology. The other passengers, a merchant couple and a traveling reverend, had chosen to wait with the driver and his horses, sheltered beneath the overturned coach box. Clara had chosen to walk. She could not entirely explain why, except that something in her had been walking for a very long time already, and stopping now felt like surrendering. The storm had other opinions. By the time she saw the orange flicker of firelight through the pine trees, she could not feel her hands at all, and her breath was coming in short, crystalline puffs that dissolved immediately into the dark. The snow was past her ankles. Her satchel felt heavier than iron. She had been following what she thought was a trail, but what turned out to be a frozen creek bed, and she had fallen twice, and the second time she had lain in the snow for a moment longer than she should have because it had not felt entirely terrible. That thought, that lying in the snow might not be terrible, had frightened her enough to get back up. She pushed through a stand of spruce trees and stumbled into a clearing, and there it was. The cabin was not large, but it was solid in a way that very few things Clara had encountered in her life had been. It was built from logs that had been stripped and fitted together with a craftsmanship that suggested someone had taken genuine time and care, someone who intended to stay. A stone chimney climbed the near wall, and smoke was rising from it in a thick, steady column that got torn sideways by the wind, but did not waver at its source. There was a small barn to the left, and through its walls she could hear the low, sleepy sound of horses. A woodpile taller than she was stood against the cabin's east wall, covered with a slanted roof of its own. Whoever lived here had prepared for winter as if winter were a worthy adversary. The door opened before she reached it. He stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand, and what she was fairly certain was a Winchester rifle in the other, and he was the largest man she had ever seen outside of a traveling circus bill. Not large in the soft, overfed way of the merchants and landmen who had passed through her uncle's parlor. Large in the way that the mountains behind him were large, dense and structural, as if he had been put together not by any ordinary biological process, but by the deliberate stacking of stone upon stone. His shoulders nearly filled the doorframe. His chest, visible beneath an open flannel shirt, was broad and defined in a way that made Clara think of the draft horses her father had kept before everything went wrong, powerful and patient and capable of enduring enormous weight. His forearms, exposed to the elbow where his sleeves were rolled back despite the cold, were corded with muscle in a way that she found, to her considerable embarrassment, difficult not to stare at. His hair was dark brown and long enough to brush his collar, which gave him a slightly wild look that the hard line of his jaw and the flat assessing quality of his eyes did nothing to soften. His eyes were gray. She noticed that even in the lantern light. A clear, cold gray, like the sky an hour before a storm breaks. He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. She looked back at him with what she hoped was dignity, and not the faint pre-collapse swaying she could feel in her own legs. "You alone?" he said finally. His voice was low and direct, the kind of voice that did not waste effort on volume because it did not need to. "Yes," she said. "Stage breakdown?" "Axel," she said. He looked past her into the trees, scanning the darkness with the rifle still loose in his right hand, not pointed at her but not put down either. Then he stepped back from the doorway and held the lantern out toward her. "Come in then," he said, "before you fall down." She wanted to say something sharp and independent in response to that, something that established clearly that she was not the kind of woman who fell down, but her legs chose that particular moment to deliver their honest assessment of the last 3 days, and she had to grab the doorframe with both hands to keep from proving him exactly right. He caught her elbow before she could. His hand was enormous and warm, and she felt the grip of it through her coat sleeve, steadying, unhurried. "I'm fine," she said. "You are half frozen and about to go down," he said, which was not said unkindly, but it was said with the kind of certainty that made arguing feel like a purely theoretical exercise. "Come inside." She came inside. The interior of the cabin was one large room with a stone fireplace along the far wall that was doing its job with extraordinary conviction, pushing heat into every corner with a generous crackling authority. The floor was swept wooden planks. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed along the left wall, wide and built from the same peeled logs as everything else, covered with what appeared to be several wool blankets and a bearskin. Shelves along the right wall held an organized collection of supplies, flour, coffee, dried meat, tools, ammunition, arranged with a neatness that Clara found unexpectedly touching in a man who looked as if neatness might be beneath his dignity. A rifle and a long hunting knife hung on pegs beside the door. On the table was a half-eaten meal and an open book, which Clara noticed and filed away. He set the lantern on the table and leaned the Winchester against the wall and turned to look at her properly in the firelight. She was aware, suddenly and acutely, of what she looked like. Her dark hair had come entirely free from its pins and was plastered to her face and neck in wet, tangled ropes. Her coat was soaked through. Her skirt was weighted with snow and ice to the knee. Her cheeks were bitten raw by the cold, and she was shaking, a fine, uncontrollable trembling that ran from her shoulders to her feet, and none of this was how she had intended to present herself to anyone. Ever. Particularly not a man who looked like he had been assembled by nature specifically to make lesser physical specimens feel their inadequacy. She lifted her chin. "Thank you for letting me in," she said. "I will leave at first light. I do not intend to impose." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, though it did not develop into one. He crossed to the fireplace and added 2 logs from the stack beside it, then straightened and looked at her again with those gray eyes that had, she noticed, a quality of complete attention that was simultaneously uncomfortable and not entirely unwelcome. "Take off your coat," he said, "and your boots. You will lose your feet standing in wet leather." "I am perfectly—" "Take them off," he said again, not louder, just with a slight added weight that made the instruction feel like the only reasonable option. Then, almost immediately, something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of conscious adjustment, as if he had heard himself. "Please," he added, and the word sat a little stiffly in his mouth, like a tool he did not use often but understood the purpose of. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she set down her satchel and began working the buttons of her coat. His name, she learned, was Elias Cord. He had lived in this cabin in the San Juan Mountains for 4 years, since 1875. Having come up from New Mexico after a period of his life, he described in 3 words, working cattle, mostly, that she understood to mean he was not going to describe it further. He was 30 years old. He trapped and hunted and sold furs down in Silverton twice a year and had a standing arrangement with a trading post there for his surplus meat. He grew what vegetables the high altitude would permit. He kept 2 horses, a mule, and a small flock of chickens whose welfare, he mentioned with no particular expression, he took quite seriously. He told her this while he heated water on the iron stove beside the fireplace and produced a tin cup of coffee that was so strong and so hot that when she wrapped her still clumsy fingers around it, she felt the warmth travel up her arms and into her chest like a physical mercy. He had put her coat and boots by the fire on a wooden rack that served exactly that purpose, and he had produced from somewhere a pair of thick wool socks that he set beside her without comment, which she put on with a gratitude she would have died before fully admitting. She told him her name. She told him the stage had broken down 1.5 miles south on the pass road. She told him she had been heading for Denver. She did not tell him why she was running, or from what, or from whom, and he did not ask, which she decided meant either that he was unusually perceptive or unusually indifferent, and given the quality of his attention, she suspected it was the former. He ate the remainder of his supper while she thawed, and he set a plate of salt pork and cornbread in front of her without ceremony, and she ate it with the focused intensity of someone who had not eaten a real meal in 2 days, and she watched him not react to that with what she chose to interpret as tact. "You can have the bed," he said, when the fire had burned lower and the worst of the shaking had left her body. "I will not put you out of your own bed," she said. "I have slept on worse than a floor," he said, with the kind of absolute matter-of-factness that meant the statement was almost certainly true, and that he had made his decision and it was not up for debate. She looked at the bed. She looked at the floor. She looked at Elias Cord, who was currently spreading a bedroll out beside the fire with efficient, unhurried movements, already settled in his choice and seemingly unbothered by the entire situation. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said. She crossed to the bed and sat down on the edge of it, and the wool blankets were rough and clean-smelling, and the bearskin on top was heavier than anything she had slept under since her childhood, when the winters had been cold and her father had still been alive, and the world had still been a place that contained warmth by default. She reached for the knot of her shawl at her shoulder and then stopped. She was aware of him still in the room, not watching her. He was arranging his bedroll with his back to her, but there, present, large and solid in the way that the fireplace and the cabin walls were large and solid, and she was wearing the shawl wrapped around herself over her dress in the way she always wore it, tight across her shoulders and chest, because her dress fitted her as most of her dresses fitted her, which was to say, imperfectly, pulling across the hips and the bust in ways she had been taught to understand as failures of her own body rather than the dresses, and the shawl covered the pulling and the fullness and the general abundance of her that she had spent years being informed was excessive. Her fingers hesitated on the knot. Elias sat down on his bedroll and then lay back on it with one arm under his head, looking up at the ceiling with eyes that were already growing distant with the kind of tiredness that the outdoors produced in a person who worked in it all day. "I'm going to blow out the lamp," he said. "Yes," she said. "In a moment." He waited. Her fingers moved to the knot again, and she thought about her Uncle Gerald saying in his patient, measured way that a woman her size needed to be careful about the impression she made, needed to make extra effort, needed to understand that fullness in a woman was tolerable only if it was contained. She thought about the women in the fashion plates in the magazines that used to come to the house before the money ran out, all of them narrow and precise as pencil drawings. She thought about Thomas Hadley, who had courted her for 4 months, and then said, almost kindly, that he had hoped she might slim down some over the summer, and the fact that she had not was really a fundamental incompatibility of expectation. She thought about all of that, and then she unwrapped the shawl and laid it across the foot of the bed, and she lay down in her dress which fitted her as it fitted her, and she pulled the blankets up, and she said, "You may blow out the lamp now." He did. In the darkness, with the fire crackling low and steady and the storm working itself out against the cabin walls with diminishing conviction, he said, "There is an extra blanket on the shelf if you need it." "I am warm enough," she said, and then, after a long pause, because she was not entirely sure why she said it, except that the darkness made saying things slightly easier, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Cord. You did not have to let me in." There was a brief silence. "Yes, I did," he said. And then nothing else. She lay awake for a while, listening to the storm and the fire, and thought that she had no idea what was going to happen next, and found for the first time in 3 days that this was not an entirely terrible feeling. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of the door, and gray morning light was coming through the single window, and the storm had passed, leaving behind it the kind of profound white silence that only deep snowfall could produce. Clara sat up and pushed her hair back from her face and looked around the room with the brief, disoriented clarity of waking somewhere entirely unfamiliar. The fire was freshly stoked. The coffee pot was on the stove. A bowl of dried apple slices was on the table. Elias was not inside. She heard him outside a few moments later, the rhythmic crunch of his boots in the snow, and then the sound of the axe striking wood with a cadence that was so regular and powerful, it was almost musical. She rose from the bed and went to the window and looked out, and he was at the woodpile in the early light, splitting logs with a methodical force that she watched longer than was strictly necessary. He had his coat off despite the cold, working in his flannel shirt, and every motion of the axe was clean and economic. No wasted movement anywhere in his large body, the muscles of his back and shoulders flexing and resettling with each strike in a way that was genuinely difficult to look away from. She stepped back from the window and poured herself coffee. When he came back inside, he was carrying an armful of split wood, and his cheeks were red from the cold, and his dark hair was disordered by the wind, and he brought with him the smell of pine sap and fresh snow and cold air. And he looked, she thought, entirely at home in himself in a way that she had never managed in her own body. "Morning," he said. He loaded the wood beside the fireplace and brushed bark from his sleeves. "Snow is about 2 feet on the flat, more in the drifts. Pass Road will be closed for at least 2 days." Clara absorbed this information. 2 days, she said. "At minimum," he said, without any particular inflection, neither apologetic nor satisfied about it. "Well," she said, "I'm sorry to impose for that long." "You are not imposing," he said, which was brief and final in the way that all of his statements were brief and final, and he poured his own coffee and sat down at the table and opened his book where he had marked it the night before. She looked at the book. "What are you reading?" He turned the cover toward her. It was Thoreau. She blinked. "You are reading Walden," she said. "I've read it 4 times, he said. "I find new things in it." He paused. "You know it?" "My mother had a copy," she said. "She read it to me when I was small. There's a passage about being rich in proportion to the number of things you can let alone." Something changed in his face then, not dramatically, not in any way she could have easily described, but something in the quality of his attention sharpened. "Sit down," he said. "There's enough apple for 2. She sat. They ate breakfast across the table from each other in a silence that was, Clara realized slowly, not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that existed between people who did not need to fill space simply to occupy it. She could not remember the last time she had sat in silence with another person and not felt the pressure to perform. "Do you read much?" he asked eventually. "When I can," she said. It was not encouraged. He made a sound of acknowledgement that contained, she felt, a great deal of understanding without requiring elaboration. "There's a crate of books under the bed," he said, "if you're going to be here 2 days. She looked at him. He was reading again, his big hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and his expression was entirely neutral. She looked under the bed. There was indeed a crate, and in it were perhaps 30 books. Thoreau, Emerson, a battered copy of Shakespeare's collected works, 2 novels by Charles Dickens, a field guide to Rocky Mountain flora, a surveying manual, and a book in Spanish whose spine she could not quite read. She pulled out the Shakespeare and sat cross-legged on the floor beside the bed and opened it to the middle. From the table, without looking up from Walden, Elias Cord said, "The sonnets are in the back." Clara turned to the back. She read sonnets. The fire kept them warm. Outside, the snow held the world in a kind of muffled suspension, and the morning stretched out slow and golden around them. By the time midday arrived and he was preparing a pot of bean soup from what he had on his shelves, she had learned the following things about Elias Cord: that he had grown up in Santa Fe, the son of a Mexican mother and a Scots-Irish father, which explained the Spanish book, that he had worked as a cattle hand for 7 years, working his way up through New Mexico and Colorado, and then as a scout for a surveying party mapping the San Juan Range, and that it was the surveying work that had first brought him to this valley, that he had built this cabin with his own hands over the course of 1 summer and 1 fall, working from a design he had drawn himself on paper he still had folded in the book crate, and that he had at one point read for the law in Santa Fe under a judge who had eventually died of influenza, and that this was a chapter of his life he did not seem to know quite what to do with, the way a man sometimes accumulates a skill he never deploys. He learned that she had grown up in a small town in eastern Colorado before her father died of a fever when she was 15, and that her mother had followed 2 years later of what Clara privately believed was grief made physical, and that she had gone then to live with her Uncle Gerald in Pueblo, who was her father's brother and a man who had built his entire understanding of the world on a foundation of what other people thought of him. She told him about Gerald's house, its propriety and its coldness, but she did not yet tell him about the arrangement Gerald had attempted to make, the negotiated engagement with a 52-year-old widower named Cornelius Marsh, who owned 3 dry goods stores and needed a housekeeper more than a wife, and who had looked at Clara's body with an assessment so purely practical that she had felt like a horse being evaluated for purchase. She did not tell him about the morning 3 days ago when Gerald had informed her that the wedding would take place in 6 weeks because Marsh was impatient and Gerald had debts that required settling. She would tell him. Not yet, but she would. There was, she found, something about Elias Cord that made telling feel like a possibility rather than a vulnerability, and she was not entirely sure how he had managed that in the space of 1 night and 1 morning. The snow settled deeper over the next 2 days, and something else settled too, something that neither of them named but both of them felt, a kind of ease, a familiarity that should have taken much longer to develop, and that developed anyway, perhaps because of the forced proximity, perhaps because of the books and the fire, and the long evenings when the world outside was white and silent, and there was nowhere to be except here. On the second evening, she finally told him about Gerald and Cornelius Marsh. And she told him plainly, without dramatics, watching his face as she spoke. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, his forearms on the table and his gray eyes on her face. And when she finished, there was a silence. "He sold you," Elias said. His voice was even, but something in the flatness of it was, she thought, more eloquent than outrage would have been. "He would not have used that word," she said. "The word he would have used does not change what it was," Elias said. She looked at him. The firelight was in his eyes and across the broad planes of his face, and she thought that she had never met a man who said exactly what he meant without embroidery and without performance. "No," she said, "it does not." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were right to run." 3 words, plainly stated, and she felt them settle in her chest in the place where 3 days of cold and fear and doubt had been sitting, and some of that weight shifted. "I was afraid I was being foolish," she said. "I had no plan. I had no one to go to." "Plans can be made," he said. "People are harder to find." She did not entirely know what he meant by that, but it lodged somewhere and stayed. On the 3rd morning, the snow began to melt, slowly, the way mountain snow did when the temperature rose through single degrees, and Elias saddled his larger horse, a broad-shouldered bay he called Marshall, and rode down to the pass road to assess its condition. He came back 2 hours later with the news that the stage company's men were clearing the road, and it would likely be passable by tomorrow, or the day after. Clara was at the table, having reorganized his supply shelf by category, which she had done not because she thought his organization was wrong, but because she had needed something to do with her hands. She heard him come in, and she heard him stop, looking at the shelf, and she turned to face whatever his reaction was going to be. He looked at the shelf for a moment, then he said, "The coffee was on the right." "The coffee is now beside the tea, which is beside the other dried goods," she said. "It makes more sense." He looked at her. She looked back. Then he crossed to the shelf and looked at her organizational system with the focused consideration he appeared to bring to everything, and then he picked up the coffee tin and moved it 2 inches to the left, and she decided that was as close to approval as he was going to give her and chose to accept it. "Road should be clear by the day after tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. He went to the fire. He poured coffee. He sat at the table. He did not open his book. She sat down across from him. "What is in Denver?" he asked. "Hotels need housekeepers," she said. "I can cook and clean and organize clearly." She nodded at the shelf. "I will find work." "Do you know anyone there?" "No." He wrapped his hands around his cup. He looked at the table surface for a moment, then looked up at her with eyes that held something she was by now learning to recognize, the particular quality of attention that meant he was about to say something he had thought about carefully. "Denver is a hard city for a woman alone," he said. "Not impossible, but hard." "I am aware," she said. "I'm not telling you not to go," he said immediately, in a way that suggested he understood exactly how that might have landed. "I'm noting a fact." "Noted," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, as if measuring each word before he placed it, "I go down to Silverton in 2 weeks, to sell furs and restock. I could take you there instead. There's a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Dodd, who takes in women who need a decent situation. Silverton is a mining town. It needs cooks and laundresses and bookkeepers. It is not Denver, but it is honest work." She looked at him. He met her look without flinching, and without any expression she could easily interpret. "Why?" she asked, not suspiciously, exactly, but genuinely wanting to understand. He thought about that. "Because Denver is 3 days' ride and Silverton is half a day, and I know Silverton," he said. "And because Mrs. Dodd's is a decent house, and the widow does not tolerate men who behave improperly toward her boarders." He paused. "And because you have been imposing on me for 3 days, and I owe you a favor." She stared at him. "I have been imposing on you," she said. "I reorganized that in your favor," he said, with an expression she was fairly certain, though she could not be entirely certain with this man, was dry humor. She almost smiled. She did not quite manage it, but it was close. "I will think about it," she said. She thought about it. She thought about it while she helped him feed the horses and the chickens, which she did without being asked because it was something to do and because she liked the horses. She thought about it while she made a supper of cornbread and dried bean soup, and while she read beside the fire, and while she listened to the snow drip from the eaves in the dark. She thought about the fact that she had been running toward Denver, because it was big and far and anonymous, and because she had needed to put distance between herself and Gerald's house as quickly as possible. But Denver had not been a plan so much as a direction. Silverton was a smaller thing, but it was a more real thing, and there was something to be said for real. She thought about the way he had listened when she talked. She thought about the 3 words, "You were right to run." She thought about the fact that she had read sonnets on his floor for 2 hours, and no one had made her feel stupid for it. On the 4th morning, she told him she would take him up on the Silverton offer. He nodded, as if he had expected this, or perhaps as if any answer she gave was an acceptable answer. Then he said, "Good. In the meantime, the chickens need water, and I need to check the south traps." So that was settled. The 2 weeks that followed were unlike anything Clara had experienced in her life, and she would think about them later, years later, with the luminous clarity that certain periods of one's life acquire in memory, not because they were free of difficulty, but because they contained, running under everything like a current in a river, something that felt increasingly like rightness. She was, by any practical description, a guest in a strange man's cabin in the mountains, with no certainty beyond tomorrow and no plan more concrete than Silverton. These were not circumstances that should have produced peace. And yet, she helped where she could, and he allowed it without commentary, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He did not perform gratitude for her help, but he also did not minimize it or condescend. He simply folded her assistance into the day's work as a matter of course, the way someone folds a new element into a recipe they have made 100 times, adjusting without fuss. When she cooked, he was straightforwardly appreciative, eating everything and once saying, with genuine feeling, that her cornbread was the best thing he had eaten in 4 years, which she thought was either a compliment or a sad commentary on 4 years of mountain isolation, or possibly both. He was not talkative in the way that she had learned to associate with warmth. He did not fill silences to demonstrate his feeling or his interest. But she learned to read him, learned that the way he handed her the coffee cup in the morning was an expression of something, and that when he came back from the traps and checked on her before doing anything else, it was an expression of something else, and that when he watched her from across the room with those gray eyes in that steady, careful way, that too was a language, just one she was still developing the vocabulary for. On the 6th day, something happened that she had not expected, and that rearranged several things in her understanding of both him and herself. She had been washing her dress, her only dress, the one she had run in the large basin in the corner, and she had changed into the second older dress she had in her satchel, the one she had packed because it was small and it had been her mother's, and she could not leave it behind. Her mother's dress was smaller than anything Clara owned, having been made for a woman of her mother's narrower figure, and it pulled across the hips and was too snug at the chest, in a way that made Clara acutely aware of every inch of herself, and she crossed her arms over her front when he came inside. He set down the game he was carrying and looked at her, and she felt her shoulders begin their familiar inward curl. "Do not do that," he said. She stopped. "Do what?" "Cross your arms like that. Make yourself small." He held her gaze. "You do not need to." The words landed simply, without softness or ornamentation, and she felt something rise in her chest in response. Not anger, but something adjacent to it. The emotion of someone who has been told something that troubles them because it is true. "I am not," she started. "You do it every time," he said, not unkindly. "When you come in and I am already here. When you pass me on the way to the shelf, you make yourself smaller. You do not have to do that." She stared at him. "Mr. Cord." "Elias," he said. He had told her this twice before, but had not pressed it. Now there was a slight emphasis on it that felt like it mattered. "Elias," she said. "You do not understand." "I understand," he said, "that someone spent a long time telling you that your body was a problem." He said it the way he said most things, straight, without decoration, without any cruelty in it. "And I am telling you it is not." She was silent for a full 5 seconds, which felt like a very long 5 seconds. "You cannot just say things like that," she said. "Why not?" he said. She opened her mouth, closed it. She could not, she realized, construct a genuinely good answer to that question. He crossed to the fireplace and began preparing the rabbits he had brought in, his back to her, giving her the space that she needed in that moment, and she stood in her mother's too small dress in the middle of the cabin and felt something in her chest loosen, some tightly held knot of her that had been wound there so long she had stopped feeling it and had started simply building herself around it. She unfolded her arms. She breathed. From the fireplace, without turning around, he said, "There are extra pins on the shelf if you need them for your hair." "Thank you," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which took more than it should have. That evening they talked longer than usual, the fire burning down to coals around them while they sat at the table with the lamp between them. She told him about her mother, about how she had loved Thoreau and growing sweet peas along the fence, and how she had laughed at her own jokes before she finished them. He told her about his mother, who had grown up in Santa Fe before it was anything the Americans would have recognized, who had known the names of every plant in the desert and every star in the southern sky, and who had said that a man who could not build something with his hands could not build anything worth having. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said. She was, he said. He said it simply, and the simplicity of it contained everything. "When did you lose her?" 12 years ago, he said. "Fever. Same year I started on the cattle drives." He was quiet a moment. It was easier to keep moving. She understood that. She understood it in a way that went deeper than words. "Is that why you came up here?" she asked. "The mountains? The alone?" He considered this honestly, as he considered everything honestly. "Partly," he said, "and partly because this valley is the most beautiful place I have ever seen, and I wanted to live in it." She thought about that for a moment. "I believe you," she said. He looked at her across the lamp, and there was something in his eyes that she did not quite have the language for yet, and she thought perhaps she was getting there. 3 days before they were to leave for Silverton, the trouble arrived. It came in the form of 2 men on horseback, which Elias heard first, the sound of horses on the approach trail, moving with more speed than the snow conditions warranted. He was outside, splitting more wood, when Clara heard the change in the axe rhythm, and then silence, and then his voice, low and carrying, from outside the cabin. She went to the window. 2 riders had pulled up in the clearing. Both were dressed for the mountain cold, which was not unusual, but there was something in the way they sat their horses that Clara had learned, in 3 years under Gerald Whitfield's roof, to recognize, the ease of men who expected to get what they had come for. She went to the door and opened it, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the men, and one of them looked at her, and she felt the bottom of her stomach drop. His name was Pete Marsh. He was the younger nephew of Cornelius Marsh, the man her Uncle Gerald had intended her to marry. He was about 25, wiry and narrow-faced, with eyes that sat too close together above a thin mustache, and he had ridden with a group of men who worked for his uncle in a capacity that was described as general assistants, and that generally assisted in making certain that Cornelius Marsh got what Cornelius Marsh had determined was owed to him. Gerald had sent him. Of course, Gerald had sent him. $300 in debts required that Gerald get the arrangement back on the table, and for that, he needed Clara back in Pueblo, and for that he needed to find her. And Gerald had apparently decided that the stage's broken axle on the pass road was a reasonable starting point. Pete Marsh looked at her in the doorway and smiled in a way that had no warmth in it. "There she is," he said to his companion rather than to her. "Miss Clara Whitfield. Your uncle has been powerful worried about you, Clara." "I am fine," she said. "Your uncle would like you to come home," he said with the patient, reasonable tone of someone who considers alternatives to be theoretical. "No," she said. Pete Marsh's smile did not change. He shifted on his horse. He looked past her into the cabin and then at Elias, who was standing to the left with the axe loose in his right hand and no particular expression on his face, and Pete Marsh did some kind of assessment and turned back to Clara. "Your uncle has a legal arrangement," he said. "You are of age, and the contract is signed. Mr. Marsh is owed—" She said no. Elias's voice was not loud. It was not threatening in any performed way. It was simply a fact, deposited into the air between all of them. Pete Marsh looked at him fully for the first time. Something in his expression recalculated. "This isn't your concern, mountain man," Pete said. "She is standing in my yard," Elias said. "That makes it my concern. A contract binding a woman to a man she has not agreed to marry is not a contract the law recognizes in any territory I know of," Elias said, in exactly the same tone in which he said everything else. "A woman of age cannot be bound. I read law under Judge Harlan Creasy of Santa Fe for 2 years. Tell your employer." Pete Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his companion, who had the expression of a man who had not been paid enough to argue law with a large, calm man holding an axe. "We will be back," Pete said finally. "You are welcome too," Elias said. "The coffee is good." Pete Marsh wheeled his horse and they rode out of the clearing, and Clara stood in the doorway and let out a breath that felt like it had been held for approximately 3 years. Elias came to the door and looked past her into the clearing until the sound of the horses had faded, and then he looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "You did not mention the contract." "I did not think they would follow me up here," she said, which was honest. "We leave for Silverton tomorrow," he said. "That is a day earlier than planned," she said. "Yes," he said. "Pack what you need. I will be ready at first light." He paused. "And Clara?" She looked at him. He had used her first name only a handful of times. "They will not take you back," he said. "Not while I am standing." She looked at the man in front of her, at the absolute steadiness of him, the lack of theater, the plain and total sincerity, and she felt something open in her chest that had been shut for a very long time. "I know," she said, and she found, saying it, that she meant it entirely. They left at first light the following morning. Elias packed Marshall with the furs he had been readying and the supplies that needed restocking, and he helped Clara onto the second horse, whose name was Rosie, and who had the sweet, sensible temperament that her name suggested. Clara had not ridden in several years, but she found it coming back to her as Rosie ambled down the switchback trail through the mountain morning. It was a clear day, cold and brilliant, the mountains standing up around them in every direction with the kind of beauty that felt aggressive, almost rude in its extravagance. The snow on the high peaks caught the early light and burned white gold against the blue sky, and the pines below the snow line were dark and fragrant, and Clara rode through it all and felt something that took her a while to identify as happiness. Not the pressed, careful, fearful thing she had been performing as happiness for years in Gerald's house, but something that moved through her freely, without conditions. Elias rode beside her on Marshall, easy in the saddle the way men who have lived on horses are easy, and he pointed out landmarks as they descended. the peak that caught the first snow of any season, the creek that held the best trout in the fall, the south-facing slope where, he said, wild strawberries grew in summer in quantities that made the bears territorial about it. Bears, she said. They are manageable, he said. That is a word that accommodates a great deal of optimism, she said. He looked at her, and she saw it properly this time. The full, clean, unguarded thing that passed across his face when she made him laugh, even when the laugh itself was only a fraction visible, because he was still and always going to be a man who kept most of himself below the surface. But the laugh was there. She was sure of it now. "You are funny," he said, as if this were a discovery he was still integrating. "I know," she said. He looked at the trail ahead and she saw the corner of his mouth. Silverton was smaller than Pueblo, but busier in a different way. The compressed, purposeful busyness of a mining town in the middle of its expansion, all muddy streets and hammering, and the constant conversation of men who were either making money or trying to. It sat in a high valley between peaks that felt close enough to lean on, and the air at this altitude had a quality that Clara felt in her chest immediately, thin and cold and clean. Elias took her first to Mrs. Dodd's boarding house, which was a white-painted building on the better end of the main street, neat and well-maintained and managed by a woman of about 50, with iron-gray hair and eyes that assessed Clara in approximately 3 seconds and appeared to make a favorable conclusion. "She is a friend of mine," Elias said to Mrs. Dodd. "She needs decent lodging and honest work." "There is always work in a mining town," Mrs. Dodd said. She turned to Clara. "Can you cook?" "Better than you would expect," Clara said. Mrs. Dodd looked at Elias. Elias looked at nothing in particular. Something passed between them that Clara did not quite catch. "I run a clean house," Mrs. Dodd said to Clara. "Boarders follow rules. You will be safe here." "That is what I need," Clara said. She was shown a room, small, plain, with a window that looked out at the mountain to the west, and a bed with a proper mattress and a washstand and hooks on the wall for her coat and her dress. It was small and it was plain, and it was hers, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment with both hands around her satchel strap, and felt the extraordinary, unusual sensation of being exactly where she meant to be. Elias found her there 20 minutes later when he came to tell her he was heading to the trading post, and he stopped in the doorway of the room and looked at her in the small bare space and said, "Is it all right?" "It is perfect," she said. He nodded. "I will be in Silverton through tomorrow," he said. "If there is trouble, find me at the trading post or at Harding's livery. I will hear about it either way." She looked at him in the doorway, enormous and steady and real, and said, "Elias, I do not think Pete Marsh will trouble me here. But thank you." He held her gaze for a moment. "I will stop by in the morning," he said. He did. He came by in the morning and sat in Mrs. Dodd's parlor drinking coffee while Clara helped with breakfast, and they talked in the easy, unforced way they had developed in the cabin, and Mrs. Dodd moved in and out of the room with the expression of a woman who was choosing very carefully not to have an expression. After breakfast, Clara walked with him to the livery to collect Marshall, who was rested and ready and considerably more interested in leaving than Elias appeared to be. They stood outside the livery in the cold mountain morning with the street activity of Silverton moving around them, and Elias held Marshall's reins and looked at her in the way she had learned to read. "I will be back in 2 weeks to sell the second lot of furs," he said. "I will be here," she said. He mounted Marshall and settled in the saddle and looked down at her with those gray eyes and said, "Take care of yourself, Clara." "You as well," she said. "Watch out for the bears." He turned Marshall down the street and she watched him go, and she thought that she was either in a great deal of trouble or the beginning of something very important, and she was not entirely sure, in that moment, which was which. Silverton took to her quickly, or perhaps she took to it quickly, which amounted to the same thing. She found work within 4 days, first helping Mrs. Dodd with the boarding house cooking, which Mrs. Dodd paid fairly for, and then through Mrs. Dodd's introduction, cooking breakfast and midday meals at the mine office where the company foreman had been managing on biscuits and goodwill for 2 months and was prepared to pay handsomely for someone who could produce a reliable, hot, filling meal for 12 men at 7 in the morning. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work. It was one of the things she had been able to do well without anyone telling her she was doing it wrong. And she had developed, in Gerald's kitchen, a facility with flavor and volume that translated very well to a mining camp environment where the primary requirement was that the food be copious and honest. The miners were respectful in the way that men who live hard, physical lives in dangerous conditions are respectful of someone who feeds them properly, with a gratitude that bordered on devotion and a straightforward decency that she found, coming from where she had come from, deeply pleasant. She also began to handle the mine office's accounts when it became apparent 3 days into the job that the ledger system the foreman was using was a creative interpretation of double-entry bookkeeping at best. She had learned accounting at a young age from her father, who had believed firmly that women should understand where money went, and she reorganized the mine office's records in 4 evenings and presented the foreman with a clear accounting that revealed he had been overcharged by his supply company for 7 consecutive months. The foreman, whose name was Jed Crocker, was a large and amiable man from Ohio who shook her hand after this revelation as if she had pulled him from a burning building. She was earning money. She had a safe room. She was well fed. She had Mrs. Dodd, who had revealed herself to be a woman of considerable intelligence and dry wit, and who was becoming a friend. She had, for the first time in a long time, something that could legitimately be called a life. And she was thinking about Elias Cord approximately constantly, which was inconvenient, but did not appear to be stopping. He came back in 2 weeks, as he had said he would, and then again 2 weeks after that, and by the 3rd visit, she had begun to suspect that Elias Cord did not require quite this much supply restocking, and that the furs were not, in fact, the primary motivation for the trips down from the mountain. She kept this suspicion to herself for reasons that were not entirely clear to her, except that the entire developing situation had a quality of extremely fragile normalcy that she did not want to disturb by naming it. She learned more about him, each visit adding another piece. She learned that he had a scar along his left forearm from a trapping accident in his first mountain winter that he described with characteristic understatement as a miscalculation involving a beaver trap and overconfidence. She learned that he had a genuine and particular appreciation for music, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that he could not carry a tune, and that on his infrequent visits to town, he would sometimes sit at the back of the saloon for an hour purely to hear the piano player. She learned that he had once, over the course of 3 consecutive winters, taught himself to read Spanish well enough to work through Cervantes in the original, and she found this so unexpectedly moving that she had to look out the window for a moment to compose herself. He learned things about her, too. He learned that she had a habit of organizing things by principle rather than convention, which accounted for the coffee incident, but also for a general quality of her thinking that he clearly found interesting. He learned that she had once wanted to teach school before the money ran out and the choices ran out along with it. He learned that she was deeply stubborn in the best possible way, which was the way where stubbornness connects to conviction rather than to pride. He learned that when she laughed, really laughed, which she was beginning to do more frequently, it was the kind of laugh that made a room feel larger. On his 4th visit to Silverton in late November, he stayed 2 days because an early ice storm made the pass road treacherous, and on the first evening he came to dinner at Mrs. Dodd's boarding-house table as he occasionally did, and afterward he and Clara sat in the parlor while Mrs. Dodd made a very pointed exercise of retiring early, and the lamp was between them on the small parlor table, and the fire was going, and they were talking about Thoreau, and then not talking about Thoreau, and then just talking. The conversation moving the way good conversations move when both people are genuinely interested in what the other has to say, ranging through subjects without plan or agenda. And at some point in the second hour, Clara looked at Elias Cord and thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its simplicity, I love this man. Not the desperate, convincing kind of love, not the kind she had watched other women construct out of need and fear and the absence of better options. The real kind. The kind that arrives without announcement and sits down as if it always belonged. She did not say it. She was not ready to say it, and there was, in any case, something that needed to be worked out first, something that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the first night in the cabin, gathering itself. She waited until they had talked themselves to the comfortable end of the evening, and she was walking him to Mrs. Dodd's front door, and he was pulling his coat on, and she said, "Elias, can I ask you something honestly?" He turned. "Yes," he said, as if there were no other acceptable category of question. She looked at him carefully. "When you come down to Silverton," she said, "how much of it is actually for the supplies?" He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face did not quite move, but something in his eyes did. "Some of it," he said. "How much?" A pause. "Less and less," he said. She breathed. "I see," she said. He was watching her with the focused attention that she now knew was how he paid respect to things that mattered to him. "Does that bother you?" he said. "No," she said. "It does not bother me." He nodded slowly. He did not move toward the door. Neither did she. "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name, carefully, as if it were something he was holding in both hands, made her breathing go slightly unsteady. "Yes," she said. "I would like permission to court you," he said. "Properly, if that is something you want." She looked at him, at the broad, steady, mountain-made reality of him, at the gray eyes and the dark hair and the enormous, capable, gentle hands, at the man who had pulled her in from a blizzard and fed her and listened to her and told her she did not have to make herself small, who had read Thoreau 4 times and was still finding new things in it, who had run off Pete Marsh without raising his voice, who had come down from his mountain every 2 weeks not for furs but for this, for her, for the particular quality of her company, which apparently meant something to him that he had difficulty saying, but not. She was learning, difficulty showing. "Yes," she said, "that is something I want." Something happened in his face then that she had not seen before, a full, unguarded opening, brief as a door blown open by wind and then settling again, but completely real. He reached out and took her hand, and his hand was warm and enormous around hers, and he held it for a moment. "Good," he said. She walked up the stairs to her room that evening, feeling like the floor was slightly higher than she had previously understood it to be. The courtship was, appropriately, a Elias Cord production, which is to say it was sincere, unconventional, and entirely itself. He did not bring flowers, which would not have survived the mountain winter anyway. He brought things that were real, a book of Keats that he had ordered through the trading post because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she had never read him. A rabbit fur-lined pair of gloves because he had noticed her hands turned red in the cold. A set of accounts ledgers that he had purchased in Silverton and inscribed on the inside cover in his precise, slightly formal handwriting, "For the woman who makes sense of numbers and other complicated things." She kept all of it. She would keep all of it for the rest of her life. She gave him things too. She cooked things she knew he liked and brought them wrapped in cloth when she knew he was coming through. She found him a survey map of the San Juan Range at a surveyor's office in Silverton, more accurate than any he had, and she framed it and hung it against the wall in the boarding house parlor until he could take it back up the mountain. She talked to him honestly, which she had come to understand was the thing he valued above almost everything. The directness, the absence of performance, the willingness to say what was true without dressing it for presentation. And she began to feel, over these weeks, that she was inhabiting herself differently. Not in any dramatic or sudden way, but the habit of curling inward, of crossing arms and hunching shoulders and shrinking, was loosening. She noticed it first in the mirror one morning, that she was standing straight in her dress, her shoulders back, not as a deliberate act of resistance, but simply because there was no one in her life anymore telling her she should do otherwise. The dress still fitted her the way it always had. Her body was exactly what it had always been. But the story she was telling herself about it was changing, slowly, in the way that stories change when someone who sees you clearly insists on a different narrative. She thought about what he had said that afternoon in the cabin, in her mother's too small dress. "You do not have to make yourself small." And she thought about how those words had landed, and how they kept landing every time she was in a room and felt the old impulse begin. She was learning to let them land. Christmas came to Silverton with a foot of fresh snow and a quality of celebration that had the energetic, slightly desperate warmth of people far from home making their own light. Mrs. Dodd held a dinner for the boarders and half a dozen neighbors, and Elias came down from the mountain 3 days early because, he said. Marshall needed shoeing, and Mrs. Dodd, who had somewhere along the way acquired opinions about Elias Cord and Clara Whitfield that she generally kept to herself and occasionally did not, gave him the chair nearest Clara at the dinner table without comment. It was a good dinner. The room was bright and warm, and full of people in their best clothes, and Clara had cooked most of the food, and across the table, Elias ate with the quiet appreciation of a man who understood what effort looked like, and several times she looked up to find his eyes already on her, and each time she held the look for a moment longer than the time before. After dinner, the table was pushed back, and someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing, and Elias, who had indicated no dancing ambitions at any point in their acquaintance, was found standing against the wall, watching with an expression Clara had come to recognize as interest, concealed under habitual self-containment. She crossed to him through the dancing couples. "You do not dance," she said. "Not in front of people," he said. "Interesting distinction," she said. He looked at her. "I said not in front of people," he said. "Not that I do not dance at all." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took his hand, her hand in his enormous warm one, and drew him toward the corner of the room where the lamplight did not quite reach. He danced with her there, in the near dark, not well, but honestly, his hand at her waist with a care that was different from dancing, and more like something else entirely. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of him, and she looked up and found that his face was very near, and his gray eyes were very clear and very certain. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her, quietly, carefully, with the whole of his attention. When they separated, she could hear the fiddle and the voices from the other side of the room, and her heart was an entirely unreasonable instrument. "I've been wanting to do that for a while," he said. "How long?" she said. He considered this honestly, as he considered everything. "Since the first morning," he said, "when you moved the coffee tin." She laughed, and the laugh was the big, free kind, the kind that filled space without apology. He smiled at that, the full version, not the partial one, with both corners of his mouth and something genuine and warm all the way through his face, and she thought she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. The winter passed and the spring came up through the mountain valleys in stages, first the green thread of it in the south-facing canyons, then a broader sweep through the lower meadows, then finally, reluctantly, the high country releasing its snow and turning the color of new grass almost overnight. Clara had been in Silverton for 6 months, and she had saved money, and she had friends, and she had work that mattered, and she had Elias Cord, who came down from the mountain now every week without any particular pretense about furs. On a Saturday in early April, 1880, he came into town with something different about him. She noticed it immediately, a quality of decision in him, which was not entirely unusual since he was generally decisive, but this was a different kind, the kind that comes before something irrevocable is said. She noticed it, and she let it settle, because she had learned with him that things arrived when they were ready. They walked after dinner, as they had begun doing on good evenings, along the edge of town where the mountain came down close and the aspens were just beginning to break into leaf, the new growth a yellow-green so bright it seemed to generate its own light. The mountains were enormous around them in the evening, the peaks still snowed under, and the air smelled of pine and creek water, and the particular mineral smell of cold stone warming in spring sun. They walked for a while in comfortable silence, and then he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and he looked at the mountains for a moment and then looked at her. He said, "I want to ask you to marry me." She looked at him. "I want to ask," he said carefully, "but I want you to know first that I understand if you are not ready for that. What you ran from was a life where you were not asked, you were told, and the last thing I want is for this to feel like one more thing being decided for you." He held her gaze steadily. "So I'm asking, not telling." She was quiet for a moment, and she felt the spring evening all around her and the mountains and the thin, clean Colorado air. And she thought about the window she had climbed out of in October, and all the cold miles after it, and the lantern light at the cabin door. And she thought about the first morning, and the coffee, and the Shakespeare, and the chickens. And she thought about the way he had said you were right to run and you do not have to make yourself small. And she thought about all the things they had told each other in lamplight and firelight and the gray mountain mornings, the slow, honest accumulation of it. Yes, she said. Elias. Yes. He put his hands on either side of her face, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was completely unguarded in the way she had seen once before, at the Christmas dance, and she thought that for a man who kept most of himself below the surface, the things that got through were extraordinary. He kissed her, there in the spring evening with the aspens going green around them and the mountains watching over it all, and when they separated, he was still holding her face, and his thumbs were at her cheekbones, and his eyes were the clearest she had ever seen them. "We should tell Mrs. Dodd," he said. "She already knows," Clara said. He looked at her. "She has known for months," Clara said. "She mentioned it in November." He took this in. "Of course she has," he said. Mrs. Dodd, when they told her, said, naturally, in a tone of profound vindication, and then produced from somewhere a bottle of excellent whiskey that she had apparently been keeping for exactly this occasion, and gave them both a glass. They were married in June of 1880 in a small ceremony at the Silverton Church, a new building that smelled of fresh lumber and pine resin and had a view through its single window of the mountain to the north that was, Clara thought, probably the most honest altar backdrop available to anyone in Colorado. She wore a dress she had made herself over the winter months when she had begun to suspect where things were going, a deep blue wool that fitted her properly because she had made it for herself, for her actual body, and she had not taken in any of the measurements or made any of the adjustments that would have made her smaller than she was. Mrs. Dodd had helped her with the buttons. Elias stood at the front of the church in a clean white shirt and his best coat, his dark hair combed back and his gray eyes on Clara the entire time she walked up the aisle, and his expression was the expression of a man who could not quite contain what he felt, but was not, for once, trying to. He held her hands when he made his vows, and he meant every single word with the particular, total sincerity that was simply his natural register, and she made her own vows and meant them the same way. And when the minister said they were married, he kissed her in front of the whole Silverton contingent, Mrs. Dodd and Jed Crocker and half the mine crew and a goodly portion of the town who had assembled out of the frank, friendly nosiness that small mountain towns produced. And someone cheered, and someone else started playing the fiddle immediately. And it was good. They had a wedding dinner at Mrs. Dodd's that lasted most of the afternoon and into the evening. And at some point, Elias took both of Clara's hands across the table and looked at her with steady gray eyes and said, "I have a question." "Yes," she said. "The cabin needs a second shelf," he said, "for the books. I was wondering if you had opinions about the placement." She stared at him for a moment. "You are asking me about shelf placement," she said. "You reorganize the existing shelves very effectively," he said. "I thought your expertise should be consulted for the expansion." "Elias Cord," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at this man who had pulled her out of a blizzard and fed her soup and handed her Shakespeare and told her she did not have to be small and come down the mountain every week for her company, and asked her to marry him in a way that made it clear it was a question and not a command. And she thought about how it was possible to be enormously surprised by a person even when everything about them was consistent and real. "Left wall," she said, "between the window and the fireplace where the light is good." "That is what I thought," he said. "Good." She laughed and he smiled his full, warm smile, and Mrs. Dodd refilled both their cups. They went back to the mountain that summer, she and Elias, back to the cabin he had built with his hands in the high valley, and Clara found that what had felt like a temporary shelter the first time she arrived felt now like something else entirely. She had a hand in the arrangement of it from the first morning, and Elias let her change whatever she thought needed changing with a complete and genuine openness that might have surprised people who had not spent time with him, since he had built the whole thing himself, but did not surprise her, because she understood by now that his relationship with what was his was not about possession, but about care. And she was hers, and she had the same access to his things that he did, which was the access of someone trusted. The second shelf went on the left wall between the window and the fireplace. They filled it with books over the course of that first summer together, new ones ordered through the trading post, and some she had brought from Silverton, and some he had added to over the years, and together their combined collection became the kind of library that visitors to the cabin remarked on, slightly awed, and that Elias dismissed with characteristic brevity by saying, "A winter is long." She learned the rhythms of his days, and he learned hers, and they fit together in the easy, unself-conscious way of things that belong in proximity. His early rising and the coffee ready when she came to the table, her preference for working in silence in the morning and talking in the evenings, his reading in the lamplight and her accounting in a ledger she now kept for the supply calculations, the long summer evenings on the cabin steps when the sky went pink and orange above the peaks and the world was quiet enough to hear the creek. She learned to ride Marshall properly, which took 3 weeks, and the patient cooperation of Marshall, who was in Clara's view the most dignified horse she had ever encountered. She learned the names of the trails Elias used and the location of the traps and the markers that indicated which valleys were safe and which were not in early winter. She learned from Elias how to read the sky for weather with the kind of accuracy that a mountain winter required, and she learned which plants in the meadow were edible and which were medicinal, and which were, as Elias put it with dry understatement, inadvisable. He learned from her. He learned more about cooking than he had ever expected to learn, and he applied it with the methodical focus he applied to everything, and eventually became capable of producing meals that were genuinely good rather than merely sufficient. He learned what she had observed about the mine office accounts, not the specific figures, but the general principle of how money moved and where it could be recovered, and applied it to his own fur and game business with results that were measurably better within a year. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, to say more of what he meant out loud rather than by implication, because she had said once, very gently, that she appreciated the implications, but words were also good, and he had taken this to heart in the serious, committed way he took everything to heart. He was also, consistently and without theatrics, the most protective person she had ever been near in her life. Not protective in the way that was really control-wearing a caring face, not the way Gerald had been, invoking her safety as a justification for her restriction. Protective in the way that was entirely structural, that built itself around her without diminishing the space she occupied, that said, "I am here, and not you cannot go." He walked on the outside of her on every street. He scouted the trail ahead when the conditions were uncertain. He responded to any situation that presented a threat to her with a calm, complete, absolute readiness that was more effective than anger, because it never required escalation. She had not heard from Gerald Whitfield since the morning of Pete Marsh's visit to the cabin clearing, which she suspected Elias had ensured by some communication she had not been fully informed of and chose not to press on. She did ask him once, in the spring, and he said, "I wrote to Judge Harlan Creasy's successor in Santa Fe, who confirmed in a letter to Gerald Whitfield that no contract binding an adult woman to a man she has not agreed to marry is enforceable in any Colorado or New Mexico court. I also suggested, in a separate personal letter, that pursuing the matter further would be unwise." She looked at him. "How unwise did you suggest?" she asked. "Sufficiently," he said. Gerald Whitfield did not pursue the matter further. The autumn of 1880 was a good one, and the winter that followed was hard in the way that mountain winters are hard but manageable, in the way that hard things are manageable when you face them with the right person. They were snowed in for 3 weeks in January, which produced an intimacy of the daily that Clara thought was probably the truest test of a relationship. Being in close quarters through weeks of gray, cold days with no one but each other and the horses, and they came through it not merely intact but with a deeper familiarity, the kind that only sustained proximity can produce. By spring of 1881, Clara knew she was carrying their first child. She told Elias on an April morning very similar to the April morning the year before when he had asked her to marry him, spring coming up through the canyon with its provisional green, the aspens beginning again. She told him after breakfast, while they were still at the table, and she was watching his face when she told him. Something happened there that she would never forget. He was still for a moment, not stunned, not alarmed, but deeply, completely still, in the way of a man who has received something he did not think to expect and is carefully taking account of its weight and its reality. And then, Something broke open in him the way spring broke open in the high country, not gradually but all at once, and he got up from the table and came around to her side, and he put his arms around her and held her for a long time without saying anything. "Elias?" she said against his shoulder. "I know," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "I know." She felt him breathe. She felt the entire solidity of him. "Are you frightened?" she asked. He pulled back enough to look at her. He thought about this honestly, as he always did. "Yes," he said. "A little, are you?" "A little," she said. "But mostly not." "Good," he said. "Mostly not is good." He held her face in his hands the same way he had in the spring evening when she had said yes. "You will be extraordinary," he said. She pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes. They made plans. They talked about whether to go to Silverton for the birth. Elias was firm about this, not because he was afraid, but because he respected what he could not control, and a mountain birth in isolation was not something he was willing to risk. And Clara agreed, because she was not interested in dying for the principle of self-sufficiency. They would go down in July, when the baby was due in August, and stay with Mrs. Dodd until the birth and through the early weeks. Mrs. Dodd received this news with the expression of a woman who had been expecting it, which was simply her expression in general when it came to matters relating to Elias and Clara Cord. Their son was born on the 15th of August, 1881, in a room at Mrs. Dodd's boarding house with a midwife who had attended most of the births in Silverton for the past 6 years. It was a long and difficult labor, and Clara would have preferred to lie about this, but found she was too tired for lying, and Elias sat outside the door for 11 hours, which she knew because the midwife came out twice to tell him things, and both times she could hear his voice through the door, low, steadied, waiting. When the midwife let him in and placed the baby in his arms, Clara watched his face do the thing it had done when she told him she was expecting, the stillness and then the opening, and then something else. Something she had no name for, something that was entirely new on a face she thought she knew comprehensively by now. He sat beside her on the bed, and he held the baby, and he looked down at the wrinkled, dark-haired, emphatically disgruntled face of their son, and he was very quiet for a long time. "Hello," he said finally to the baby, quietly as if they were being introduced in an ordinary social situation. "I am your father," Clara laughed, which hurt but was entirely worth it. "He has your hair," she said. "And your mouth," he said. "Look at that." He looked at her over the baby's head, and his eyes were very bright, and his jaw was tight in the way it was when he was containing something substantial. "Are you all right?" "I will be," she said. "I'm quite all right." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, and his lips were warm, and she could feel that he was holding the kiss deliberately, like a pause. "Thank you," he said against her forehead. "It was a mutual effort," she said. "Clara," he said, pulling back to look at her. "Elias," she said. "What do we name him?" he said. She had thought about this. She had thought about it for months, lying awake in the mountain dark with the baby moving inside her, turning names over. "James," she said. "James Elias Cord, for my father and for you." He looked down at James Elias Cord, who was currently demonstrating the lung capacity that would characterize the next 3 months with considerable conviction. "Good name," Elias said. They went back to the mountain when James was 6 weeks old, the three of them on horseback through the autumn morning, Marshall patient and steady with the new weight and the new sounds, Rosie following with the packs. Clara rode with James strapped against her chest in the carrier she had made, and she felt the familiar quality of the air as they climbed into the high country, the cold and the clarity and the particular blue of the sky above the peaks, and she felt the same thing she had felt riding down to Silverton for the first time, the happiness that moved freely, without conditions. Elias rode beside her, checking on her every 20 minutes or so with a look that was both reassurance and request for reassurance, and she gave it both ways, and they rode through the golden autumn and back up to the cabin and to the life they had built there. That life continued to build itself, year by year, the way good things build, gradually and solidly, each piece fitting because it was true rather than because it was forced. Elias expanded the cabin over the second winter, adding a second room along the east wall so that James would have space of his own in the years to come. And Clara oversaw the placement of every window and every shelf and one additional door that opened south onto a small wooden porch where, she had decided, she would grow sweet peas in the summer in her mother's memory. The sweet peas came up the first June and climbed the porch rails in pink and purple and white, and she sat on the porch steps in the mornings with her coffee and James in her lap and looked at them and felt her mother's presence in the living things and was grateful. James grew with the rapid, absorbing conviction of a mountain child, walking at 10 months, talking at a year with a directness that Elias observed dryly was possibly genetic, and by the age of 2 was following his father around the clearing with an expression of total focused attention that was so precisely his father's expression that Clara often had to look away to maintain her composure. Elias was patient with him in a way that was neither soft nor indulgent. He answered questions honestly. Regardless of the complexity of the question, he gave the boy appropriate tasks and took the results seriously. He read to him every evening the way Clara's mother had read to her. James Cord grew up knowing that the world contained bears and Shakespeare and survey maps and sweet peas, and that his father would pick him up if he fell down and put him back on his feet and ask him to try again, and that his mother's laugh could make a mountain morning feel like a gift. The following spring, Clara discovered she was expecting again, and she told Elias at the table and watched his face do the same thing it had done before, except this time with an additional quality that she thought was probably joy becoming familiar with itself. Their daughter arrived in the autumn of 1883, small and decided, with Clara's dark hair and Elias's gray eyes and a quality of opinion that was immediately, unmistakably her own. They named her Ruth Margaret Cord, for the midwife who had been present for both births, and for Clara's mother, Margaret, whose Thoreau was still in the book crate and whose sweet peas still came up every June. With 2 children, the cabin was full in the best possible way, full of noise and motion and the specific chaos of small people developing their understanding of the world at high speed. Elias took it in with the same calm, total presence that he brought to everything, and Clara watched him with their children and thought about the man who had stood in a doorway in a blizzard with a lantern and a rifle and assessed the situation and made a decision, and how all of it, every decision, including and especially her, had been made with the same steady, unhurried certainty. There was a morning in the summer of 1884. James was 3 and Ruth was nearly 1, and the mountain was doing its summer best, the meadow below the cabin an extravagance of wildflowers, and the sky above the peaks the specific blue that Clara had come to think of as the truest color in the world. When she was sitting on the south porch with her coffee, the sweet peas rioting up the rails around her, and Elias came out from the cabin with the baby on one arm, and James following at his heel, asking rapid and sequential questions about elk tracks they had seen that morning. She watched him settle on the step beside her, enormous and easy and completely here. James climbing his leg with the familiar confidence of a child who has never doubted that the mountain under his feet is solid, and Ruth reaching for Clara's coffee cup with the focused ambition that was already entirely her own. "Do not give that to her," he said. "I was not going to give it to her," Clara said. "You gave her the molasses jar last month," he said. "That was a lapse in judgment," she said. "Papa," James said from somewhere around Elias's knee, "do elk live in the same place always, or do they move?" "They move," Elias said, "with the seasons, come up in summer, go down in winter." "Like us," James said. Elias looked at Clara over their son's head. She looked back at him with the look that was her and his private language, the one that had developed over 4 years of a life built together that contained too many things for any one word. "We stay," Elias said to James. "This is where we live." "Always?" James said. "Always," Elias said. James accepted this with the gravity appropriate to important information and went back to examining the porch boards for additional wildlife evidence. Ruth, thwarted on the coffee cup, had found Clara's braid and was conducting a leisurely investigation of it. The sweet peas moved in the mountain breeze. Elias put his free hand on Clara's knee, unhurried, certain, and she put her hand over his. She thought about the window she had climbed out of on a cold October night 5 years ago, running away from a life that had been arranged around the contours of everyone else's needs and expectations, running toward something she had not yet been able to name. She thought about the snow and the dark, and the cold so profound she had lain down in it, and the orange flicker of firelight through the trees. She thought about the door opening and the lantern and the enormous, gray-eyed, steady man in the doorway. She thought about all the ways she had been told in the years before him to be less than she was, all the ways she had practiced disappearing inside her own life, and she thought about how it felt now to be entirely present in it, to take up exactly the space she took up, in this body that was hers, in this mountain, in this morning, in this life. Elias turned his head and looked at her, and there was a question in it, the way there always was, the quiet checking in that was simply part of how he was made. "I am wonderful," she said before he could ask. Something warm moved through his face. "I know," he said. The mountain morning held them all in its blue and gold, and James found what he was looking for in the porch boards, and Ruth fell asleep against Clara's shoulder, and Elias sat at the center of it, solid, present, entirely real, and the sweet peas climbed their rails in pink and purple and white, reaching toward the sky the way growing things always do, the way people do, given light enough and room.